Welcome to Heaven's Edge. Platform of nutrient exchange is appropriate for your life form.
An ale, I guess?
Sympathizing ale?
Alright, thanks. Let's try it. It's actually pretty good.
Attention Spacers, welcome back to another thrilling episode of Adventures in the Void. We are a sci-fi tabletop role-playing game discussion transmission. I am Jake.
And I'm Ross.
Join us as we trade tales and celebrate the beauty and wonder of the cosmos.
Welcome back to the Adventures in the Void Spacecast. My name is Ross McClure, and here we talk about independent science fiction tabletop role-playing games. Today I'm joined by Omer Golan-Joel. He's the owner of Stellaga Publishing and the author of the Cepheus Engine and Cepheus Games, which uses the open gaming license to create a series of games based on 2d6. That's two six-sided dice, which comes from the original Traveler game from 1977 for science fiction role-playing games. These games include things like Cepheus Atom and Barbaric. There are various minimalist indie RPGs that come from that game engine, but notably it also includes the game that I think of when I think of indie science fiction tabletop role-playing, which is Cepheus Deluxe. The really great thing about Cepheus Deluxe is its layout and presentation. It's similar to other OSR products. That means that it's referee-facing. It's easy to read, it's easy to use at the table as an actual book, and it's friendly to new referees that are just starting out. One of the really amazing things about this indie approach to 2d6 science fiction role-playing is if you want the brand version of the 2d6 science fiction game, which is from Mongoose Publishing, and it is a fantastic book, and it is worth this price, but you will pay $60, and that's not even including shipping. But for Cepheus Deluxe Enhanced Edition, you can get a print-on-demand hardcover for $22, and it includes the PDF. And for the PDF alone, you just pay $10. I'll include information about Cepheus in the description, but given that price difference, it's what I'd recommend as the starting point for someone in science fiction tabletop role-playing. Welcome, Omer, to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Did I get anything wrong, or is there anything you want to add about Cepheus or Stellaga?
You described the Cepheus engine quite well. I should add that we are not the only publishers of Cepheus.
Okay.
There are other versions and several other excellent publishers. Essentially, we have an ecosystem of Cepheus products by several publishers in every genre imaginable, from westerns to time travel to fantasy to science fiction, of course. I think there are now 800 titles on Drive-Thru RPG related to the Cepheus engine.
That's okay. That's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. It makes me think of like Independence. I think is it Independence Games where, they have an entire science fiction setting. They've got a science fiction setting for Cepheus where you can be in our solar system, which I think is really interesting and novel. And it's presented in a way where you can buy it and put it down at the table and play. And in a similar, affordable way. You can get it through Drive-Thru RPG and print on demand and things like that. And so I'm glad you brought that up. And so if someone wanted to make a science fiction role-playing game, they could use the Cepheus license, right?
Exactly, it's still OGL, so there are certain pitfalls in it because, as you most people remember, Wizards of the Coast tried to get rid of the OGL, of the Open Gaming License, in January 2023, and it didn't
The
work
treachery.
for them. But they are still trying to. They still may try to do it again.
Right.
So now we are working on something using the Creative Commons license, which is much safer because it's a general license used in art and software, and no one is going to cancel it because they want to do it.
Yeah.
Uh, but still, CFIUS, as long as the OGL stands, it's quite easy to create a CFIUS game. There are several reference documents which are explicitly open for use in your own games. And indeed, you simply take the text. You could. I know someone who took most of one of my products with my support and created a game set in the modern times rather than science fiction. Most of the text was similar,
Wow.
but it's part of how the open gaming license works. And we have no problem with this. We are sharing the reference document. What we own are the settings and the art. The rules themselves belong to the community.
Wow, that's really cool. I mean, that's one of the things that I think a lot of us really love about the independent tabletop role-playing game space. On the podcast, we call it folk RPGs, where it's something
Yes.
that sort of is driven and comes up grassroots from the community, and there's this sense of open collaboration and networking and sharing, and I really love that. I want to ask you more things about Cepheus, and at the end of the podcast, I really want to know about this upcoming project. But Omar, the reason I wanted to talk to you is I wanted to get some of your broader thoughts about science fiction tabletop role playing. Now, I came from fantasy tabletop role playing. I dungeon mastered, and I played some things before this because my original game master didn't like Dungeons and Dragons. He hated it. But I always had this kind of forbidden curiosity because that group didn't like D&D. And so when I broke into D&D early on in the D&D Renaissance around 2015, I just stuck with, when you want to play D&D, I'm like, well, what do? You go to the store and buy it off the shelf. So at the time, that was Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. So I ran that and played it for about 6 years. And then around 2021 or so, discovered the indie world. And both powered by the apocalypse type things like Dungeon World and Monster of the Week, but also the old school Renaissance with like minimalist games and more improvisational games, things that are more free form and open-ended, and some of them have older design aesthetics and things. And I always say that improved my hobby like 10 times. That's when my hobby exploded right there. And now I'm discovering, so I'm a person who came from that direction, and now I'm discovering science fiction tabletop role playing, really. Now I've tried a few things before all this. The initial question most people ask, and we had an episode about this, is how do you play D&D in space? And people hear me bring this up several times, and the first thing I say in response to that is, don't play science fiction games. They're there and they're made for that, and they're very good for that. Now you can play D&D in space. We also covered White Star RPG, which is where I'd point people to for that. But here I am, and I'm fairly new. We've been running Classic Traveler now for about 4 or 5 months. And I'm new, so I want to ask you some questions from that perspective, okay? And one of the first things is, in this transition, where you're like me and you're transitioning from the brand game or from fantasy role-playing into science fiction, in an interview you said that one of the main draws to Traveler initially, the kind of the grandfather of science fiction role-playing, was how free form it was. I believe you said you came from like Shadowrun, right?
Yes, Shadowrun is an excellent setting, but the rule system is extremely complex. That is, rules, very exact rules for everything. You roll a bucket of dice, the famous feature of Shadowrun. You roll sometimes 12 or 20 d6s. And
Wow.
at certain point, I found that both Shadowrun and Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition were burdening me. That is, preparation as a game master took me too much time to deal with all the mechanical stuff rather than with the plot and with setting and NPCs and cool stuff. So initially I moved to basic fantasy RPG, which is a D&D clone, BX D&D clone,
Oh,
my
wow.
basic game.
Okay.
One of the first, it was in 2009, I think, when the OSR began. So I started with it, and suddenly it was so easy to create adventures and to play D&D like I remember it from the second edition. I started with the second edition. This was my introduction to the OSR. Traveler I discovered a bit earlier, around 2000, which was given to me as a bargain when I bought Shadowrun books. But it was a revelation because the system itself, one of my friends calls the reprint I had a VCR manual, but because it was early 1980s design with minimal art, but it was an excellent game. Is still an excellent game. I see it as an inspiration for what I do because it's so clearly designed and it gives the referee the exact tools he needs to create a universe and to run adventures in it without too much handholding. That is, you don't have the grand plot you sometimes see in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. The plot is emergent from what the players do. And even the referee doesn't know the exact plot beforehand. Sometimes the rule asks you to roll for stuff as a referee rather than plan them ahead. And it's indeed very freeform. That is, it, it was designed to play any science fiction scenario. Eventually, it developed its own very famous setting, the Third Imperium, but the original game didn't come with a setting and didn't need a setting. It was, had the science fiction scenario you wanted to play out. You have the rules, you could change them very easily. There are no interdependencies between the rules almost. So you could replace any part of the rules you want. You could change if you want something closer to Star Wars. You could have something closer to Star Wars.
That's a good point,
You
actually. Yeah, that there
yes,
are these like
you want
native. There are these rules that, like, for example, the jump takes approximately 168 hours. Well, you could change that, and that doesn't change the rule that says you should roll for a wilderness encounter once per hour. Like, those two things don't depend on each other. So you could take one or the other
exactly
out or move it around. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
yes. So it permits you to change whatever you want. It even had examples of adaptation of all the kinds of science fiction characters in one of the early supplements from the 80s. They had Darth Vader, they had
Oh, wow.
Dumares, of course, without the names. Even then, even back then, you couldn't really put the names.
Yeah.
Even some people were less litigious. But you had, Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, and you could stat them in Traveler. Of course, the combat rules are a bit uh, harsher than what you have in Star Wars, because you could change them. You could add very easily, like I did in Sifis Deluxe, add a hero point mechanism where you could use some kind of metacurrency to reroll stuff, and then lethality goes down, and you could have your uh, cinematic escapades. On the other hand, you could go to much harsher system and play Alien or Aliens, where
Yeah.
people die left and right, and having a horror scenario. There is one of my colleagues in Zoser Games. They have a not alien system called Hostile, which is the best alien RPG, more
Oh,
than
cool.
the official one.
Right.
I could give you the link to that. And again, the essence of Classic Traveler and of Cepheus is that you could do anything you want with it as long as it's relatively gritty. And another thing, another feature which is harder to change is that you're playing competent adults rather than playing kids right off the farm, which is a
Right.
standard fifth edition of Dungeons and Dragons. Less in earlier editions, but now it's you always start the youngsters who create off the farm and miraculously grow into heroes within 3 months. Doesn't work as a traveler. You start after a career. You're usually in your 40s or 30s, and you have professional skills. You're expected to be a professional, and you are assumed to be competent. One of the reasons they are using the 2d6 mechanism is that it gives you a more effect for your skill because
Right.
it's in a curve. So modifiers are more meaningful. When you're rolling d20, it's linear. So sometimes when I play Dungeons and Dragons, especially the newer editions, it feels like your character is very incompetent because you could be a high level master of your craft and you will fail 50% of failure you will have.
Yeah, I had that experience. One of my friends played this half orc cleric who, he had spells that he could call down thunder and kill 20 people at once, but for some reason he could also slip and fall on a banana peel. Like, you couldn't, if he was trying to complete a simple task resolution, he would just slip and fall and roll twos and fives and sixes all day. And it didn't. There was this cognitive dissonance. So yeah, it's interesting how revolutionary just having that bell curve is to the effect of role playing and what it says about genre. Okay, so real quick, also I want to ask now. I'm going to ask a lot of questions about this at the end, but the upcoming RPG, what is the title of it?
It's called Faster Than Light Nomad or FTL Nomad. It uses a basic 2d6 mechanism, but with many differences from Cepheus. Among other things, it doesn't have the random character generation system. It has simpler skills, so you could simply point by them very easily. And you could create a character within 5 minutes and start adventuring. Of course, you do have a lot of options to choose from, but you could build your basic character quickly. Combat is of similar lethality to Traveler. It's quite gritty, but you have options to soften it.
Okay,
I always believe in giving options to the referee.
sure.
Space travel is a little bit harder in terms of science. That is, you have rockets. Unless you're in extremely high technology, you have reaction drives, and like Traveler. And the system design is based on it. You have trade-offs. When you're designing a starship, you have trade-offs using the same mass you have. It's quite easy, actually. We don't believe in extremely complex crunch. Of course, it has encounter rules and animal rules, and it's going to have very comprehensive referee advice for beginning referees
That's really good.
because I think any core book needs this unless you're using a very lightweight system. Generally, it's fast play yet deep. science fiction role playing game, which is we expect it to be about 160 A5 or digest pages
Oh, interesting.
in
Okay.
size. It's a bit smaller than Cepheus Deluxe. It's about the size of Cepheus Lite we published earlier,
Okay.
judging from the word count of our draft. Generally, it could play a very wide variety of genres. We do like harder settings, but if you want to play something closer to the grittier end of Star Wars, if you want to play something closer to the grittiest end of Star Trek, you could do it.
Yeah. I want to return to this idea of these types of games having a kind of gritty basis. So that is because actually my friend Father Chris and I, he's kind of like my main co-host to talk about Traveler, and we had just spoke about this how you could do Star Wars, but there is this underlying assumption that the world is real and it has physics. It's physical and material, and you can't break the material, as opposed to, say, space opera or speculative fiction, where you could just and should maybe hand wave that, like things like distance, rate, and time matter. Now, so I'm going to return to that idea in a second and get your perspective on it, because you've mentioned this a few times, like, hey, you can do this, but it's grittier. But would you say that that Faster Than Light then continues in this kind of DNA strand from Traveler of classic science fiction role playing?
It's quite different from Traveler. It has inspiration, draws inspiration from it and from other games.
Ah, okay.
But we decided to start our own game. We had creative freedom. We are not bound by any genre
Right.
conventions, unlike Cities Deluxe, which is still a Cities game and thus compatible with the old Traveler SRD. So we have the creative freedom, which means we are doing very thoroughly. And once it is playtested, it planned to be a very, again, fast, easy system you could use on the fly without too much bureaucracy or paperwork that some systems demand from you,
Yeah.
which is
So you
very
still
important.
prefer that kind of minimalist improvisational form of RPG? Like you'd say that's still kind of what you enjoy, and what you and the other people you're working with, like, that you all enjoy creating and playing?
It's not exactly minimalist. Again,
Ah, good point.
it's about 50,000 words book.
That's a
Unlike
good.
minimalist,
I
we
apologize.
have
That's a good point. Because can you say, for example, that so we're the last season we were playing Shadow Dark, and it looks that way, but that's not exactly true. Like, these games have rules for the world, which is different, right, than having a bunch of crunch. So yeah, yeah, a good point.
it's a simulationist game,
Ah, okay.
while Shadow Dark is gamist, closer to gamist. It doesn't. The essence of a simulationist game is that the game world has a life of its own outside of the party. So we have rules for creating worlds. We have rules for all kinds of encounters that could happen, which are not centered on the player characters. Things happen in the universe outside of them.
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Very cool.
Which is the idea of simulationism. Again, the world exists, the world has rules. It doesn't revolve about the players or around winning encounters or around the central and pre-planned plot. The plot is emergent. That is one of the ideas I really like. In older simulations games, again, you play, player characters could do whatever they want, and the story emerges from it and from the consequences of the action.
I really enjoy that also. I've loved that. Well, that's really exciting. Okay, so um, here I am. I'm making this transition into this type of gaming. One of the things I've noticed, there's tons of resources if you're interested in Traveler, which I'd say is kind of like the Father Chris and I agree that that's almost like the D&D of sci-fi RPGs. It's sort of like the gorilla in the room or the locust that a lot of people work from. But I nonetheless, I've noticed that it's a much smaller community than the fantasy RPG community. And I'm wondering, why do you think that is? If you think, or maybe you disagree, but do you think that's the case?
No,
And
no.
why is that?
Fantasy in general as a genre is more popular than science fiction, especially in recent years. Science fiction was more popular in earlier years, but there are probably very deep sociological reasons for this. But again, even in terms of literature, fantasy, especially fantasy, doesn't have to follow the rules of physics and look plausible. You could have write anything you want. Much easier to write fantasy than good science fiction. It's even easier to write space opera than harder sci-fi, but even space opera has its own rules. You couldn't simply handwave everything, which you do in fantasy. And there is the issue that in fantasy, everyone knows the basics. Know what a horse is, what a sword is, what you do in an inn. So you don't have to describe the details. Once you get into aliens and spaceships, you have to describe a lot more stuff. So it's a bit harder to write and a bit harder to refer it to game master. And but it's very rewarding in a way that fantasy doesn't always reward you. We also have fantasy games based on the same engine and the same spirit, which are quite different from D&D. You could play, I think in the playtest, one of our playtesters used the D&D Adventure playtesting, but
Oh, cool.
uh, it was Sword of Cepheus. It's another
Oh
game
yeah,
which is
sort of
Sword and
Cepheus.
Sorcery.
Yeah,
It was playtested on some kind of D&D module by one of the playtest groups. But in general, it's not a dungeon crawl game. You're not supposed to fight everything you see. Same in Civis Deluxe and in Extel Nomad. You simply don't have to fight. You don't get experience from fighting. You have a simple experience system which is based on adventures you go into, but not on combat and not on finding treasures. So the entire premise of D&D is irrelevant here. Is you're
yeah,
not going out to the world to kill monsters and grab the treasure and get experience and level up. It's much flatter progression. But again, back to the question. In general, science fiction is more complex to work with. Readers, even of science fiction novels, they expect consistency, which fantasy readers expect little less. And again, you have to describe a lot of things. You have to do much more world building. In fantasy, some people do wonderful world building, but some people don't need to. You can have a D&D adventure without any world building.
yeah.
It doesn't work like that in Traveler. You have to establish a few things about the universe.
Father Chris and I were talking about that like, what is this essential difference and what are the barriers? And one of the things is, we're terrestrial creatures. So if you describe things like hills, doors, ceilings, buildings, sky, caves, every human being knows what that is. But if you have to describe energy, matter, light seconds, radiation, if you have to describe the physical reality of space, that's just not our day-to-day experience. So there's no common point for that. You have to just know it. Like, you have to know what that is. And it seems to me like that might be kind of a decision point for people interested in science fiction role playing, is to ask yourself, and I think part of what seems to me confusing, which I think touches on what you're saying, is actually science fiction is incredibly uncommon. I've heard this said that, and what I mean by that is that what we call science fiction are actually things like psychological fiction or speculative fiction or space opera or space fantasy, and that those things aren't necessarily science fiction, right? Like, science fiction requires a wonder and love of science itself, of like reality and the laws of the universe, and that's hard because we're all trying to figure that out and learn it, and it also lends itself to that simulationism that you're describing, I think, right? Which is a joy when it unfolds, but is challenging and difficult. And when I talk to people about Traveler, that's the thing that they're immediately like, I'm already not interested, because you can die in character creation. You can begin your career with medical debt. And these are things, you have to pay a mortgage, and so these are like social aspects of,
yes.
yeah, it's part of reality, and there's a joy when there's an unexpected emergent element that comes from these realistic elements, the simulation, but you have to find the joy and entertainment in confronting that. And I don't think everybody wants to do that. So it seems to me, and tell me if this seems right to you, that for some people, initial decision point is, the initial question is, how do I play D&D in space? Usually people come to that point when they start playing tabletop role-playing games. And one point is, maybe, do you want science fiction? Because the answer might be no. And maybe you want Star Wars. Maybe you want fantasy in space. And certainly the original players and creators of original Dungeons and Dragons did that, right? Like, they played in space, and they had sword and planet and planetary romance games, and they had space fantasy and weird planetary games, and that's in Sword and Sorcery. But alternately, and what we came up with is that the sense of whether or not you can engage in this challenge and it be fun for you and worth it is if you look at something like Cepheus Deluxe, like the cover, and you look in the art in it, and you see this, the orbit of this planet, and you look at it and you say, I want to go there. Like, if there's that sense of exploration and wonder that drives you, that says, I want to go there. Or like in the text of Traveler, you said it was like a VHS manual, which is hilarious, or your friend did. And it's got that like plain text, and this font gives the sense of the word itself, where it's like, I want to go there, And if you have that bug, maybe then it's like, yeah, science fiction will be a challenge if you're like me, but I've found it a worthwhile challenge. Like, it's a challenge worth doing.
Exactly. I should note that both Cepheus Deluxe and FTL Nomad can run space opera quite easily.
Right.
Depends on official rules
It's
they're
true.
using. But the core is much harder, because you're not expected to break the rules of physics until a very, very late tech age. When of course, even in science fiction, you sometimes have that super advanced remnants of alien civilizations that break physics, like in Roadside Picnic, if you know the old Russian novel, which was later developed into Stalker, but all the science breaking stuff is for incomprehensible alien tech, mostly. And generally, again, it's closer to reality. And as you said, some people don't like the idea of more credits in space. But on the other hand, Han Solo did owe a lot of money to Jabba the Hutt, so it's part of the genre.
Yeah.
Even in Star Wars, you have loans and you have loan sharks, even more than in Traveler, I think. But still, people like D&D, I think, especially D&D, but all kind of related new school fantasy games because you could easily play the hero. You don't have to take into account all kind of adult stuff. Let's say that you could play your childhood fantasy of being
Yeah.
a knight fighting dragons. It's a very different genre, a very different approach to gaming. Do you use your brain to solve things or use your character abilities to solve things?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Um, I think a big part of this podcast is we say, you know, how can we help people? How can we help people make their way into the folk tabletop role playing game space? But in this case, into science fiction, and yeah, and we're saying like you know you can still get there if you want to have a slightly grittier Star Wars or Guardians of the Galaxy or Farscape or something like that. You can get there, but that the science fiction role playing world has as its basis science fiction, right? And so it seems like to me that there are some inherent barriers to get through. Like, you know, I have this always scares people. You know, this right here. You know, so you got force equals mass times acceleration, distance equals rate times time, gravity is 9.82 meters per second squared. Now, you don't need to know all that stuff. You don't need to be able to calculate it, but you do need to know that the distance between a typical sun and a gas giant is 600 million kilometers, and you need to know that 600 million kilometers takes you about 136 hours, which is about one jump, or it will take you, you know, the near part of a week anyways at thrust one, you know. So because all of a sudden now that means you have multiple days of space encounters, and so there's all this stuff that emerges out of that naturally from the physical world that can surprise you, and that's what's happened to us is they've had these things that none of us planned on, where they've had to evade pirates, and they had an encounter with a scout vessel that just said hi, and then within a day later they had an encounter with a pirate, and they were able to dive under fire to contact the scout vessel because all of that stuff emerged, and then they had this kind of heroic moment where the scout vessel was able to subdue the pirate where they were in an unarmed vessel. And we didn't plan for any of that, but this sense of exploration and action arose from those physical limitations. But that creates a barrier because, like, the average person day to day doesn't have to calculate distance equals rate times time, except for how long is it going to take me to get to work today, you know, or whatever, something like that. And so what are the other barriers that might be kind of in the way of somebody getting into sci-fi, and how can we help people meet those challenges?
I think one barrier is that most sci-fi, even space opera, is harsher than fantasy, especially newer fantasy. That is, you don't have resurrection magic. At least you could do it in Cities Deluxe, by the way, with cybernetics, but you don't have an easy way out of this, and you could die because again, it's grounded in reality.
Harsh realities of reality are there.
People can die, and this is something that you have to get used to. You're playing it by, among other things, for the challenge. You're playing it because you want something which requires you to think harder and to solve things sometimes without getting your guns out. One of the common mistakes of people who come from Dungeons and Dragons to harder science fiction games is trying to solve everything by combat. It doesn't work. You get killed in combat, like in the real world, unless you have an advantage, unless you start the combat on your own terms. And this is one thing. Again, the idea is that you're not playing Dungeons and Dragons. You're not in a dungeon. Most of the time. You're not fighting monsters who have to be killed. Not everything in the world is to be killed. Most stuff in the world, unlike pirates, you have to kill in some cases, but sometimes you can negotiate with them because space combat is dangerous. Again, another thing is to not to try to catalog the entire universe because it will take you a lot of time, a lot of effort. And Cepheus Deluxe and Traveler and other similar games that start without number, they provide you with tools to generate material on the fly, which still creates a consistent universe around it. And you have to use the tools. It is part of the way to cope with an entire galaxy. It's generated one star system at a time. Generate the area around your players. In Traveler, it is said that you need one subsector, which is about 20 to 30 worlds. It's enough for a campaign of several years. You don't have to generate everything. You don't have to describe everything. You have to describe, and you have to start small in some cases.
You know,
Another barrier, yes.
oh well, along those lines, and that seems like huge advice because a lot of people, when people look into science fiction role playing, usually Traveler, initially they say, "Wow, I have to create a whole galaxy or a whole sector or a subsector," and that seems really sage to say, "Look, don't try to do that. Like get the big broad strokes and then use the tools of the game." And you're right, like the game provides tools to use the natural power of our mind. We were talking about apophenia and how, like, if you have a single thing that you roll on a table and it says there's D6 tourists and there's 6 tourists there, your brain will come up with an automatic, why are the tourists there? And if you just like follow that logic, something will emerge from it and the players will interact with it. But I would note also, instead, not just limiting the scope of galaxy or sector creation, but I'm wondering, like, you take someone like me who I was out of science fiction for a long time, and now I'm rediscovering it and I'm re-entering it and I'm engaging with that challenge. I was really inspired by Runehammer. He did a video that I keep going back to called the pedagogy, like pedagogy of play, which is, his theory is that if you start a new role-playing game that you've never played and you start a character at level 1, the character is at level 1, so is the player. And by not having that system mastery, the player gets to be in the shoes of the character who's learning. And so we had a bunch of travelers. Most of them only did like a term and then they got booted out. And then one of them's old and he started with a ship, and which was a good mix. But you know, they all served in combat in the Fifth Frontier War, and they had this kind of one inciting event from the Fifth Frontier War, and otherwise they were like one-term service people, and they're all veterans, you know, in classic Traveler, like everybody's a veteran almost. And yeah, and so they all had that one shared experience, and then they're going to be a rolling stone. Then they're going to be a traveler, and they're going to do this. And so they are, you know, experts. Like, they're the people that have the skills to be travelers, but now they're going to discover the world as a traveler. And I feel like we had that experience together, where I hadn't read science fiction a long time. I didn't know how everything in space worked. And we all had that, so we all had to discover, and so did the travelers. So, like, I don't know what you think about that, but that maybe you don't have to master science fiction. Like, you can start small and then grow, you know, and learn, you know, and that's actually part of the fun. That's the really surprising thing, is that if you embrace that challenge and engage with it, that you can grow along with science fiction. Like, you can actually, that challenge is worthwhile, and just as your character accumulates credits and knowledge and factions and understands social encounters and space, you also grow into this world of science fiction as part of the journey with your character, and that's pretty cool too.
Also, the referee grows with it.
Yeah.
You're not expected to create a huge universe other than in broad strokes, because it's a very massive task to do it. You could do a lot of stuff because both Traveler and CPUs, and if your normal travel is slow. So, and most people don't travel between stars, not like in some franchises when you have a starship like a car and go anywhere seconds. Not like that. Most people don't leave their homeworld. People who live are in the military or explorers or travelers, older people who are travelers who simply belong to the caste of people who travel between stars. So discovering even a subsector in traveler terms, it's it will take you an entire campaign of several years real time to discover everything. The same as a referee. One of the ideas is you could roll random encounters. You have tools to generate the procedural to generate content. So you always have you don't have to improvise everything from your head on one hand, and you don't need story tools to build a very
Right.
pre-arranged story.
Yeah. Wow, this is really great advice. I appreciate you sharing it with people like me who are kind of fairly new and coming into science fiction role playing. So I I did want to circle back before we finish and ask some more questions about Faster Than Light. Pretty excited about that coming out. When did you say you think it might launch? Is there anything else that you want to share about
In
Faster Than Light?
February 2024,
2024. Okay.
February
February.
15th, maybe March, but
Right.
most likely February.
Will it have print on demand options from
Of course.
drive through and yeah, okay.
From both drive-through and Lulu.
That
Because I know that some people in some parts of the world prefer Lulu because of shipping reasons. For example, Lulu has printers in Australia, which drive-through RPG doesn't have, so it's excellent if you're in this part of the world. Also in the UK, again, because of all the new tax barriers, stuff like easier for Europeans to buy from Lulu, so we provide options for everyone to order it in print.
Well, I'm very excited about the release. Is there anything else, any other upcoming projects or anything that you want to share? We will include a link to your drive-through RPG page in the description and links to your products.
In March 2024, we will probably launch a Kickstarter for second edition of Sword of Cepheus.
Oh, cool.
By the time this will be published, this podcast, I think it will already be out. We're changing it. We're making it a lot less T20, a lot less D&D spirit, and more faithful to the original fiction, like Conan and Eric.
Ah, that's awesome. That's exciting.
Which was originally a design goal, but we weren't bold enough. Now we are going full speed ahead. Magic being dangerous and things like that. So sword and sorcery system. And we're working on a very large adventure for Cities Deluxe.
Oh, wow.
Called
Okay.
Starlight Cruise, which is a spy adventure on a huge passenger cruise ship in one of our settings. We have it written. We're waiting for the deck plans for the maps to be ready, and it should be out in January, I think.
Oh, nice.
Everything goes well with the art. We have several things lined up, I think, including supplements for Barbaric, which is our lighter sorcery system. We will have a monster book and a spell book, and things are going ahead quite well.
That's fantastic. I'm very excited about these releases. Like I said, we'll include a link in the description. And Omar, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and talking to us and sharing your wisdom and also the bringing people into the hobby. These are products people can afford. They can get access to them, and they're, like you said, they're yeah, I don't want to the word minimalist isn't a good term, but I had a similar experience where I came from the brand hobby. Part of it's just layout. Like the layout is like oriented towards someone actually running a game at a table. And I can say that about Cepheus Deluxe. Now again, Mongoose Traveler 2nd Edition is a good book. That's not like, anyone that knows me knows that I criticize Dungeons and Dragons 5th Edition in both book layout and adventure design, where it's just not good for being able to run an adventure at the table. But this takes it even further. Like when I look at Cepheus Deluxe, it's extremely simple. Sometimes the layout on some things are either on 2 pages or it's just right there on 1 page, and then it moves on to the next topic. You could have it right out the table and bookmarked, and you could run a whole game from the book. And so to me, that's one of the biggest things to, like, if we're going to help new referees get into this, and we're gonna help the future of the hobby, these things need to actually be usable by hobbyists and not just be collector's items or shelf products or whatever.
It's one design goal that is it's supposed to be played on a table with several people and soft drinks and fast food.
Nice.
Everything people do. And now I'm personally moving to fruits instead of fast food, but still, something you're sitting around the table with your friends or sitting on a VTT with your friends, also common today, and you're actually playing it.
Right.
It's not a coffee table book. It's not a collector item. It's sometimes quite simple in layout and art, but again, nothing should get in way of using the book. I
Right.
know several products, I'm not name them because it's impolite, that go too further with design and art and are simply unreadable. They have small white print on black pages
Yeah.
or small red print on a purple page in one case. And I think it's a mistake. I prefer to do simple text, things that people without perfect eyesight could still read. It's also a matter of accessibility, but also usability.
Yeah.
I'm writing books that people will play.
Right. That's awesome. Well, Omar, thank you so much for chatting with us.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Mythic Mountains RPG is a private online play club that focuses on folk RPGs. Folk RPGs are the games that belong to all of us. They're what actually happens at a table between friends. It's their voice that has the authority on what is fun and what works for them. Weekly, we upload our games to allow others to sit in with us. The channel isn't monetized. We don't own the artwork, music, software, or games shown in these actual plays, and you can find links to their authors in the description. Like, subscribe, and share if you wish, or don't. Just like games in person, you're welcome to pull up a chair, sit in, and watch some of our games. No performances, no fancy equipment, just regular people playing folk pencil and paper role-playing games and having a good time. We hope these games will prove a source of enjoyment to anyone just wanting to listen in, anyone looking for examples of how actual groups run and play folk RPGs, and most importantly, if you haven't found your group yet, you're welcome here at ours.